QSO Today, episode 499, Chris Rutkowski NW6V. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. This week, I want to thank Matthew Reed, K1VVM, for his $100 yearly sponsorship, and to the following regular monthly sponsors who keep the QSO Today project operational as we're about to cross the 500-episode line. Mark Farrell, VK6OP, Grayson Evans, KJ7UM, J. Gordon Betty Jr., W2TTT, Adrian Lambert, M5ADL, Robert Swain, W5APO, and Larry Classy, W4LEC. There were anonymous donors this week, and while we don't mention their names, we express our gratitude to them for supporting QSO Today. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Next week, we will reach the milestone of 500 episodes recorded and posted. This has been an almost 10-year journey. I have already recorded the interview and hope that you will find it as interesting as the previous episodes. The war in Israel and the world's reaction to it has me with my head down, doing my work, taking care of my responsibilities, and trying to help out and be kind to people in a time and place where the future is uncertain. I am proud of the upcoming 500th episode and hope to continue bringing a new interview, maybe not all historical, maybe not all biographical, but interesting and valuable. The XYL wants me to do another Academy event, and I hope that with my new ham radio events calendar, link on the page, that I can use it to choose a weekend not in conflict with the rest of ham radio's events. So stay tuned, and thanks for your continued listening and support. If you are new to the QSO Today podcast, please be sure to look at the QSOtoday.com website, where we have almost 500 interviews with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on the links that take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog contains over 500 videos on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. Chris Rutkowski, NW6V, had the best radio elmer and teacher for life in his father, a career Navy radio officer who taught life's lessons and the proper way to handle a CW key with methods that challenge the current conventions. Chris shares his history and his learning in his book, The CW Way of Life, and with us in this episode. This will be an especially valuable opportunity for any ham who wants to learn the proper use of the straight key and how to make the Morse code flow from mind through hand and back. I'm delighted to speak to NW6V in this QSO Today. NW6V, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Chris?
Good morning, 4Z1UG. This is NW6V. How are things where you are?
Things are great here. Well, let's just say things are relative, Chris. At the moment, things are great in this small circle that I'm sitting in. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast, Chris. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it probably started sometime shortly before I was born, would be my guess, because my dad was in the Navy and had been a ham for many years and was involved in radio. And apparently the room next to mine where my crib was located as a kid is where he had his shack. And so apparently I could hear Morse code coming over an amplifier over a speaker from my crib. And so I think I was being imprinted on it from the time I was a small child.
What was his call sign?
K2CAL. Is the call sign I knew him by. He had other calls, but I haven't been able to trace them all down. Apparently, because he was moving in the military all the time, they kept changing his calls and they didn't even make it into call books. He operated in Hawaii, in California, up in Rhode Island, where I was born. And then K2CAL was the call he got down in New Jersey. The other call that I saw him in was W3JGN, when New Jersey, South Jersey, used to be in the third call zone. And his call was W3JGN at the time. And so we had him by that, but K2CAL, that was the call I knew him by.
Was he military radio operator or?
Yeah, he was a Navy radio operator for, I think, 16 years
Oh,
before he retired and put himself through college. He decided he wanted to go to college and become a doctor.
how about that? Wow. And what kind of doctor did he become?
He became an optometrist. He wanted to be an ophthalmologist, but it would have
Uh-huh.
taken another 3 years of college, and then there would have been residencies and all that. And I have it on good authority that my mom would have been long gone if he had tried to do that. That simply wasn't in the cards. So instead, he put himself through, with the help of the GI Bill, put himself through college and then stayed up in Boston, going to college for 3 years. He did a 5-year program in 3 years. And got his doctor's thing, but he always wanted that. And I think part of his motivation
Yeah.
was that he really wanted to be a pilot in the military and could not be a military pilot because he did not have a college degree and it was required at the time. And I think it always really annoyed him that he wasn't able to be a pilot. He was only able to be flight crew, as opposed to being able to get up in front and hold the controls and fly the plane where it was going.
Did he become a pilot afterwards?
He did. In fact, he became a pilot in Hawaii just before Pearl Harbor. In fact, he left Hawaii only, I think, 3 months before Pearl Harbor and had been flying in and out of the airfield that got strafed by the Japanese famously, and where they shot down a couple of light planes. And in fact, I found an old photo of the plane he soloed in. When he was a young sailor, he was putting himself there. The military had a program at the time that you could become a pilot and get into air crew by getting pilot training. And so he did that on his own initiative. In all of his off time, he studied to be a pilot and a navigator. But of course, he was a radioman. That was his primary avocation. In fact, he had a lot of brothers and sisters. I don't know how many, lots. But three of his brothers, of the family, three brothers all became Navy radio ops. So
Oh,
radio
wow.
operator, being a radio operator was a family tradition of some sort. I'm not exactly sure who started it.
Was ham radio also a family tradition?
No, not that I know of. He was the only
Uh-huh.
ham that I'm aware of in that group. And his ham radio started back in the early 30s when he and a buddy from high school built spark transmitters. Even though they were illegal, they built spark transmitters using spark coils out of Model T Fords and were communicating back and forth with Morse code over a period of over a distance of a mile or so, chatting back and forth. And he learned code from his Elmer was a fellow who later became one of my Elmers. And so he picked it up very early and had a lot of aptitude for it, and was a deep lover of electronics. So when he went in the Navy in the 30s, out of high school, he went right in the Navy
Mm-hmm.
because what else do you do when you're a poor kid from an immigrant family? He certainly didn't have the money to go to college at that point in time. There was no way. So he went right in the Navy and immediately became a radio operator. They allowed him to strike for the crew very early on in his career because he was already fluent in Morse and already fluent in electronics, and so much of what he needed to learn was already part of his retinue.
Was he your Elmer when you decided to become an amateur radio operator?
Yes, and I say that and I kind of go, yes, but he was my Elmer in so many ways and in so many activities that the ham radio and electronics was just a part of it. When I was growing up as a kid, he didn't have a ham station the whole time I was growing up. He had other activities that he got into. He had about 100 fish tanks in our basement, and he got into breeding guppies. In our basement, and that was the thing he was totally
Uh-huh.
committed to when I was a kid. But there was a rack of old equipment, old military equipment down in the basement that had been his
Mm-hmm.
station in Rhode Island, and I used to go down there as a little kid and play with it and tune the knobs and dials and try to make it do things. And he kept saying, well, you want to learn about that, you want to learn about that. And then on one birthday, he bought me a receiver of my own to put up in my bedroom. and I was hooked within minutes. I think I was probably 9 when he did that.
Do you remember what the receiver was that he gave you?
Sure, a Hallicrafter's S38E, big wide thing with a
Wow.
square screen on it and a band spread across the bottom. And that was my first receiver.
And so you became a shortwave listener?
Yes, exactly. That was the start. And of course, I heard hams talking, and I heard hams using the code. And he was always there for that. But he also encouraged me again in these other sciences. The fact that I had like a biology lab in the basement, and I set up a photo lab at the back of the basement, and I set up a radio in my room, and I had all these things going on simultaneously. That were feeding that brain of mine, and it was kind of his brain was the same way. I am shocked now that I'm an old man, the degree to which I am like him, and that my career path and my the way I've managed my career path has so closely echoed his path. That of He was in the Navy for all those years and became a doctor. Then he retired from being a doctor. He kind of got bored with being a doctor. There was a choice of like they wanted him to become a partner in these big firms, the big optical firms
Right.
that have like where you kapocket a kapocket and bang things out. And he didn't want to do that, so he decided he wanted to teach electronics in a high school, and he wanted to be a high school
Whoa.
teacher.
Uh-huh.
And he became a teacher in the electronics department of a vocational high school, the high school across the street from where I grew up. And then after a few years, he ended up as the principal of that high school, and then the principal of the vocational system in the whole area where I grew up. And he was writing, and he went from fish from the 100 tanks in the basement. He went to racing pigeons, to where out on his parents' property out in the country, he had 3 big pigeon lofts with a couple of 100 pigeons in it. And we'd go out and race the birds, and they'd fly around in the sky, and we'd take them, hundreds of miles, hundreds of kilometers out into the forest, and let them go, and they'd fly back, and do all that. It was really interesting. So I had this very interesting, odd childhood. And there was flying. He got an airplane. He was still flying. He got a little air coupe, it was called. And he took me flying with him all the time. We'd go out on what he called dawn patrol. We'd go out and and fly around, and then he'd have to be back by 9 o'clock or something, because there'd be patients coming into the office, and he couldn't stay out. But we'd go out real early and go flying and watch the sun come up. And so I had all these things in my head, and radio was a piece of it. So
Wow.
it wasn't just radio.
I spent a lot of time holding the light, in the garage while whatever it was we were working on. So I learned a lot of things just by holding the light, and, for my father who was maybe working on the cars or something like that.
Yeah.
Did you hold the light a lot, and did you learn a lot of other skills from your father that
Yes,
benefited you later in life?
absolutely. I learned how to think. I learned how to take a broad viewpoint of things and to bring a multitude of mental tools to problems, that I wasn't just one thing. I was not a specialist in any particular thing. I had many things in which I was a fairly good specialist. I was well trained in a lot of small disciplines that added up into a broad scale of disciplines. Ironically, in electronics, he was so good with electronics that if anything broke in my shack, he would have it fixed before I would even figure out what was wrong. He would kind of go in and look at things and go blah, and the radio would start working again. He'd be there with a soldering iron and an axe and take things apart and have it put back together before I figured it out. So I never really learned how to fix electronic gear. I was not good at it, and I'm still to this day. If a piece of electronic gear is broken, I have to think about it for a while. It's one of the things that I ended up weakest in, was the ability to repair electronic gear. Something that maybe I'll change that before I pass from this mortal coil. I'll get out and try to do something to try to learn it. But there were so many things on it. But he was great at teaching me how to use your brain to manipulate and change and work the world.
Wow, what a wonderful tribute to your dad. So when did you get your first license, and how old were you?
1960, I got my first license. I was 11 at the time, and it was kind of funny. I got my ticket, and he had introduced me to. I had a number of Elmers, as we mentioned, a number of people who were instrumental in showing me the ropes of how things worked. Back in those days, ham radio was a lot more common in some ways. There seemed to be a lot
Mm.
more active operators. And I lived across the street from a high school field. And on one side of the field, about a kilometer away from me, there was a guy with a 60-foot tower that with binoculars, I could look at his tower. And then 2 blocks down the road, there was another guy with a tower with big beams on top of it that was there. So there were these, and that was Doc W2WOA, Doc Diesel was that, and Les Allen, W2CCO, was the guy across the high school field. And these older gentlemen took me in as a little kid and let me sit there and ask dumb questions and peek over their shoulders and turn knobs and dials and pick up skills that I wouldn't have had. I was very fortunate in that these were people my dad knew, and they were willing to let me in. As a child, I was welcome in that community. So, yeah, I had a lot of good Elmers coming
Did
up.
Did you find, Chris, that once you had the ticket, that it kind of made more of a level playing field between you as a child, as a kid, and the adults who were mentoring you?
Absolutely, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why Morse code became my avocation. I always liked it, and I was always good at it. In fact, after I got my ticket, my first QSO I had using the shack of the father of a friend of mine, one of my friends in grammar school. His dad had a ticket, and we go over there and play. And he said, "Oh, I got my ticket yesterday." And he said, "You got it with you?" I said, "Yeah." And I showed it to him, all excited. He said, "Well, let's go over and get you a QSO," and sat me down in front of his rig. That was a Viking Ranger. I remember a little Viking Ranger tube rig and an S85 receiver, and worked a guy I think out in Ohio. And I've still got the QSL card here from that one. That was a good one. But at home, I didn't have a station set up yet, and my dad said, "I'm not going to let you go on the air till you can copy and send 13 words a minute." He wanted me motivated, and he said, "If you do that, I'll help you build the station, and I'll put up antennas for you if you'll learn the code and get good at it." And so I threw myself into it, and with his help, it came fairly quickly. The basic constructs of the code, of learning the code, came relatively quickly to me. But developing speed took practice. That's true for anybody, anywhere, anytime, because there are bridges you have to cross in learning that. But so by the end of that year, sometime before Christmas, I think sometime before my 12th birthday, which was November, I had succeeded in getting up to 13 words a minute copying random groups, which is actually faster than 13 words a minute by normal measures. But I could send and receive 13, and the antenna went up, beautiful dipole antenna up on poles that he and his brothers erected in my backyard. So I had this lovely antenna back there. And I kept right on going with the code, and I kept right on practicing. And by the time I took my general exam in March of that year, when I was 12, I was copying 18 words a minute code groups, and I could send easily 18 words a minute code groups. And so I got very good at the code very fast. But interestingly, I wanted to go on phone, because on my radio, I would listen every afternoon after school. I love this story. It still cracks me up. Every afternoon after school, I would listen to a group in New York, a round table of these old farts who would get on the radio and just rag chew in the afternoons. And I really wanted to join in and participate in those conversations. And so I got my general ticket, and I'm so excited. And like 2 days after I get my general ticket, I fire up the rig in the afternoon after school, and I check into this net, and I'm talking with them. And I'm talking with this one fellow. I don't remember his name, but he was an Irishman with a thick Irish brogue like this. And he was a retired New York fireman. I mean, he was right out of a movie character, if you know what I mean. And I said, "Oh, I just happened to be that month in CQ magazine, there was a picture of me as the noteworthy novice," which was a column they used to have in CQ magazine. And I said, "Oh, it's this month's magazine." And this fellow says, "Oh, I have it right here. Let me take a look at it." And he opens it up, and it's quiet for a minute. He says, "Oh, Chris, I thought you were a little girl." I never wanted to talk on the radio again. The last thing in the world a 12-year-old boy wants to hear is that he sounds like a girl. And it just snapped me. I just couldn't believe it. I was so
That was the end of your phone career.
That was the end of my phone career at that point in time. But what I loved about Morse as it developed was the equality that I experienced. That on Morse code, the only thing that mattered, it wasn't race, it wasn't religion, it wasn't sex, it wasn't wealth, it wasn't anything else. It was, could you sling the code? Could you pound the brass? Could you make yourself understood? And so it was equality. Nobody knew how old I was. I was allowed to participate with adults in their activities on the air as another person, as a ham, not as a kid. And that was a great freedom to me, way before there was an internet. This is long before the internet. I experienced that freedom from judgment based on who I was and what I looked like. And that was very liberating for me. That was a very positive thing. And that stuck with me for life.
What was the first rig?
My first rig was that S38E that I mentioned, that little receiver with an Amico AC1, a little 3-tube transmitter where you had to wind your coils and on forms and put them in a little crystal controlled thing. And I upgraded from that to a DX40, a Heathkit DX40 that had a phone capability in it that I was looking forward to using, but it also had 75 watts instead of 15 watts, which the Amico had. The Amico was basically just a little QRP rig. I think I had maybe 2 QSOs with it ever, based on the antenna that I had. That was probably pretty good at the time. Working people with crystals, as you probably know, was a little bit different than trying to work people when you've got a VFO. When you send a crystal, all you do is you send CQ, and then you had to tune around and hope you heard somebody calling you. So getting QSOs at all back in those days, fishing for QSOs with a crystal, was a challenging sport in its own right.
But there were a lot of novices in those days, and kids and people that were in the same boat that you were in, and so.
Oh, sure.
I remember being a novice and being crystal controlled and still making contacts. Surprisingly,
I learned to not like calling CQ. I preferred to not call CQ. I preferred to call somebody else rather than have them call me. But in terms of working other people, I made a couple of friends then with people who are still friends today, and people with whom I did business with for years who became business partners. And so that those early novice experiences when I was a little kid shaped the whole future of my life, were shaped there.
It sounds to me like ham radio did play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career. What were those choices that you made, and how did that pan out?
Well, again, interesting. My dad wanted me to be a surgeon. He did not want me to be an electronics guy. He didn't think that, probably because he had gotten dissed when he was in the Navy because he didn't have a degree. He thought that being a doctor was the highest calling a person could have. So I grew up wanting to be a doctor, not wanting to be an electronics guy. And so when I went to college, I did not go. I went to pre-med, was how I started college. But my college career was extremely spotty. It was the 60s, and I found that I was not the kind of kid. Actually, I was very disappointed when I went to university. I went to Rutgers. And I was very disappointed because I thought I was going to a university, a place of higher learning. And instead, I was going to a great big, giant, harder high school. And I was disappointed. I was ready to go work on a new theory of physics. And instead, I had to, memorize all these little things that I'd memorized. And again, just had to memorize them better. And so from the beginning, my college career was not heading down the path of becoming an academic. I realized early on that was not my calling, that was not where I wanted to go, because I was interested in everything. My most interesting major when I was a senior, and I never got a degree. But because, and I'll explain it. When I was a senior, I took the first ecology course at Rutgers University that they had, and I was hooked on that. But the concept was, look at it this way. If you're an ecologist, what is not in the environment? Well, everything is in the environment: religion, art, psychology, physics, all these. So I wanted to study all of them. And so I would go in and I'd audit classes that I was interested in, rather than going to the classes I was supposed to go to. I would take alternate paths. And I got a very, very good education. But when all my friends graduated, I said, well, that's enough of that, and left. And I didn't think it would ever impact me going forward. It was only probably about 10 years ago that I thought maybe I'd go back to school and finally get a degree, because these days, if you're even filling out a job application somewhere, the computers will automatically cut you off the list if you don't have a degree. But in my work experience, and we can get into how I ended up in electronics and computers, but I mean, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were my peers. They didn't have college degrees. Why did I need a college degree? Most of the good engineers that I hung out with in the computer industry, many of them didn't have any degree. It was all what you knew and how you could do it and how you could execute were the things that mattered and that drove it. And I was kind of part of that. I guess that was being a hippie to a degree, saying that I tuned in to what I was interested in and dropped out of the things that I wasn't interested in. Later in life, I was diagnosed as having ADHD. And I think I was a classic. Yeah. Oh, really?
I have a similar experience. I was in college for 8 years, and it was because I got married that my wife says, well, you have credits in every school, Eric. I think you need to declare a major and get out. And it was only because I got married that I had to declare a major and get out. But I had a great time.
That's a very strong echo of my experience with college.
Wives are very sobering. I want to move on, she said. Oh, okay.
I didn't have a wife with that. I didn't have a wife with that kind of focus, and so I had to be my own guiding light at that point in time.
This was the beginning of the computer age.
Yep.
So how did that go for you?
I was there on day one, so to speak. In fact, I had been in Europe, I went to Europe and I went to a business school for a couple of years in Copenhagen, and lived with people from 20 different countries, and had a lot of fun learning how businesses worked and functioned as a machine, as a philosophical engine, how business worked. And I came back from that and went to visit my best friend, this fellow named Carl, WA2, what was his call? WA2OVR was his call. And we went down into his basement. He was showing me the things he was working on, and he handed me a copy of a magazine called Popular Electronics. He said, "Oh, look at this thing that just came out called the Altair, a personal computer, a microcomputer." We didn't call them PCs at the time. And he had a big board up on his wall with cards on it of business opportunities. He was always looking for something to do, and he had all these things, and one of them was microcomputers. And I said, well, tell me about that. And then he dragged out the magazine and showed it to me. And I swear to you, it was like an atom bomb going off in my brain. Everything that has happened since then was clear to me on day one. The future of the world went in front of me, and I knew where that was going. And so we started a company, immediately decided to do a company to manufacture accessories for this original Altair computer that had come out, that was in Popular Electronics magazine. And we did so and had some very nice products that were out there. And the first trade show ever held for microcomputers was held in Atlantic City in, I think it was probably 76. I believe it was 1976. And it was put together by a fellow named John Dilks, K2TQN, who was an editor for QST for a lot of years, handling the old equipment stuff. And John organized this trade show in Atlantic City, and it was held in the basement parking lot of a hotel, one of the old ratty hotels. This is before the renaissance of money coming into Atlantic City. This is when Atlantic City was falling into the woods, so to speak. And right around the corner from our little table for our outfit was another card table that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were at with the Apple I. And Bill Gates didn't make it to that first show. He made it to the second show that was held. And so I go back that far into the start of the personal computer and industry. And that was where my passion lay. I realized, because I knew it was going to change the world, make the world a better place. I hoped it would make the world a better place. I have second thoughts now. I have reservations about that original opinion. But
I think we all do.
Yeah.
And now this break. The QSO Today project that includes this podcast and the QSO Today Academy is now listener-sponsored. There are no commercial sponsors who influence the content and opinions expressed on QSO Today, including my blog posts. Disclaimer: we did not have a problem with sponsor influence when we did have commercial sponsors. The world is different now. I believe that commercial sponsorship, where you watch and listen to TV, radio, YouTube, Facebook, and X for free, does give sponsors complete control over all that you see and hear. The largest networks are now dominated by international corporations who decide in their boardrooms what we hear, know about, how we vote, and what we buy. Commercial sponsorship models for podcasts don't work, maybe for good reasons. At QSO Today, we are back to blogging and podcasting for the free expression of ideas, discussion, and the dissemination of content without commercial sponsorship. It takes everyone's ideas and approaches in our discussions to formulate our own way, with the best information available. This has always been the best formula for success, even in ham radio. So QSO Today is now value for value, following the model created by another ham, Adam Curry, K5AAC, inventor of podcasting and the value for value business model. I create valuable amateur radio content that you consume. In return, you find it valuable, then you reward the podcast with your sponsorships, donations, transcription sponsorships, and using the QSO Today Amazon link. Your supporting the podcast in this way keeps QSO Today podcasts coming to you every week since July of 2014, now approaching 500 episodes. In addition, we have over 500 educational ham radio videos from previous QSO Today Virtual Ham Expos that we also publish to allow every ham to benefit from these excellent presentations. However, all of this content has to be produced, edited, curated, and hosted on commercial platforms by me and my team to keep it easily accessible and available to you. Links and banners on the show notes pages allow you to show your support of the QSO Today project. Please support QSO Today with your sponsorships, donations, and using our Amazon links. And now back to our QSO Today. Let's talk a little bit about how did that proceed, and were you doing amateur radio at the same time?
Yes, at that time, my amateur radio career had a spotty record. When I was away in college, the first time, my dad, after I got to 18 words a minute, my dad put up a tower in the backyard with a beam on it for me. I guess I was 12, maybe 13 at the time. And then when I was away in college, a hurricane blew through New Jersey and blew the tower down. And this is while I was away at college. And the cables ripped the window frame out of the wall in my bedroom and tore all the equipment, came down. I had big, huge boat anchor transmitters and receivers that all got pulled down into a pile by the window and got rained on for the course of the hurricane and turned into a slag heap of junk, apparently. And I talked to my parents on the phone. He said, "What do you want?" And he said, "Is it okay if I just throw this stuff out?" And I said, "Yes." And fortunately, the only thing he saved were my QSL cards and my logs. Everything else went. Mm-hmm. And so I was off the air then officially until I built a station again, which was probably 5 years later before I got the opportunity to put up a station. Because I had gone then to Europe. And while I was in Europe, I had no opportunity to operate. I was much too busy doing thinking things and trying to communicate in 7 different languages and not doing all that great. You learn how to say, "Where's the toilet?" in 7 different languages. It's a very important skill.
Yeah, that's an important skill.
Thank you, excuse me, and "where's the toilet?" And after that's "how much?" You have to point and say, "how much?" You have to know how to say that. So I was out of ham radio there for a while, but always thinking about it. But then when I came back to the States and hooked up with my buddy the ham again, well, all of his friends were hams, and so I immediately was re-involved up to my elbows in ham radio with guys, and hooked up with other people who became partners in our early enterprise, all of whom were hams. In fact, most of the people I knew in the computer industry, especially in the early days, were ham radio operators. It was amazing how many hams there were. And this is in New Jersey. New Jersey doesn't get a lot of credit in the computer business, nor a lot of credit sometimes in ham radio. But we forget that I lived in Trenton, right next to Princeton, and Princeton had RCA Research and Western Electric and all these places where spacecraft were being built. So all of that space technology was very closely centered right where I lived, and all the hams there were all VHF ops. So I became engaged in them and did contesting with them and had lots of fun doing stuff. But also,
The large mainframe industry was also in that whole New Jersey Boston corridor too, right?
well, then Boston in particular had an awful lot going on with mainframe and especially with mini computers. The mini computers by then, DEC had climbed
Right.
into ascendance, and there were many mini computer companies. And we saw them as old fogies,
Right.
dinosaurs that were soon to be extinct, which pretty well turned out to be the case. They were not able to adapt to the changing environment. They would not change their positions and policies, stayed firmly entrenched in their business ethic, whereas the microcomputer industry was a bunch of wild-eyed, crazy people who
Right.
were doing things that were impossible, and just making a mess in general and not following their. I felt a little bit like it was the Revolutionary War again, where we were the guys behind rocks with squirrel rifles, shooting at guys wearing red coats who were marching up and down the square.
Put this in the right frame. It seems to me that that was when the Silicon Valley started to blossom then.
Exactly at the same simultaneously, right?
Fairchild was there. I mean, there was some semiconductor there. There was some Navy stuff there.
And Hewlett Packard was there, and that was where Intel was, and Zilog was, and all these early microcomputer chip builders, other than TI and AMD, who were down at MOSFET. It was at the time down in Texas. Were the guys, but California was the place where all the chips were being made, and that was the place where most of the early computer work was being done in the microcomputer business. That's where the San Francisco Computer Group formed up, and where a lot of those alliances formed that later became the Silicon Valley that we know today.
How did the computer business then treat you over the next years?
Well, there were good times and there were bad times, is all I can say. I went on to become the marketing director for, no, a director, not director, they didn't have directors, the sales and marketing manager for Epson, who you've probably heard of, the printer manufacturer. And I was their first American employee. When they hired me to put together their marketing program, it was like a few guys operating out of a small office in Southern California with a shipping department in the downstairs. But they were part of Seiko, as you probably know. Epson was owned by Seiko, and so they had a vast amount of capital capability behind them. And I was quoted early on in that as saying that the key technology was really going to be mass production. And that was something that Seiko could manage. And so I developed a computer system for them, which had its popularity for a time. I developed the user interface for it, which was my interest in the man-machine, the human-machine interface.
Mm-hmm.
I realized early on was what was driving me, and it really drove me my whole life, even learning how to operate Morse code and such. The operator and how machines worked, how people interacted with them is what drove me. And I developed this computer system for Epson, and it was well received in the industry. It had a very unique user interface on it, and it got a lot of praise. It earned me a nomination for a Human Factors Award by the American Human Factors Association. It was pretty good. But the hardware was spectacular. Epson made spectacular hardware. But in candor, the software never lived up to the design. It never achieved much, and it ended up resulting, it was buggy and slow. We were running, the best description was, 20 pounds of grain in a 5-pound sack is the best way to describe it. We were stuck on a Zilog Z80 8-bit processor, and we really needed a 16 or a 32-bit processor. And Zilog never came out with a 16-bit processor appropriate for use in a PC. And so Epson and no one else ever built that next level. And so we were stuck in an 8-bit environment when the world went 16-bit. And that really was our death knell.
I remember that Okidata seemed to be the Epson competitor for a while.
Yeah. That was true. They were a competitor early on, but early on they were a competitor. But after I got rolling with the marketing programs I put together and with the products that I had Epson coming out, Okidata had no chance. And none of the American manufacturers did. The American manufacturers were all not going to survive what was coming because of the mass production capability. But the Oki printers were not. Again, Oki had no salespeople in them who had their roots in the microcomputer industry. I think Mr. Tsubota, who was the president of Epson, hired me. In fact, he said to me one day, he said, "You're different." And he hired me because I wasn't one of the MBAs that the other companies were hiring to put together programs, because I was a pioneer kind of guy. I was going to throw myself into it the way I did with everything. And that was the difference perhaps between Oki and the Epson machines. But the Epson machines were on that same trajectory when I first went to work for them. And so I had to kind of, in terms of product management, I had to select the features that I wanted. I had to have manuals written in the United States because their manuals from Asia were incomprehensible and not useful. The features that Epson would say, "Oh, you can't put that feature in because it doesn't meet our level of perfection." And I said, "It's perfect for what we're attempting to accomplish out in that world out there." And so the Epson printers swept through the marketplace. And we took, in a period of 2 years, we went from nothing to something like an 80% market share in the United States. Once I accomplished that, then they said, "Well, what else do you want us to do?" And that then led to the creation of the computer system that I talked about, which we had been dreaming about back in New Jersey with all my ham buddies. We'd put together a small company. But that company wasn't able to get any financing. We had a couple of $1 million in purchase orders from computer stores, bite shops, and all these things in the early days. But raising capital to get a small company going to do manufacturing was extremely difficult. The Wall Street had taken a bath a couple of years before on all young startups. So you'd walk into places and they'd say, "Why would anybody want to do this? How can we possibly believe that you have an idea that's going to change things?" So we had the true believers on the side of the microcomputer versus, again, the industrial side. They wanted to see guys in MBAs with suits and jackets on. So we had no financing to try and build that. So we had to close that company down because we couldn't build the things for which we had millions of dollars of orders. We designed a system called the General, which was a monitor and keyboard and system all built together with built-in battery backup, by the way. That was an early design goal that we had. We wanted it so it didn't have to depend upon AC to keep running and do that. And that system then led to Epson, and from Epson, we continued developing that idea of a standalone workstation that was going to be a tool for people, that was going to be this useful tool. And so those ideas stemmed all the way back into my ham radio days. As a kid, to me, there's a logical thread that comes forward that I knew where I wanted to go and what I was trying to accomplish, and that was to make these things as easy to use as a television set. I was a true believer in the idea that computers should be so easy that a typical person should be able to walk up to one, look it over and go, "Oh, all right, I see what to do," and just start using it, as you could do with a television set at the time. There's a channel switch. I wonder what that does. Tunk, tunk, tunk. Oh, I see what that does. You're able to get this immediate feedback. And so that was basically part of the design philosophy that was used in the computer. So it was very well received in the press, very well admired, but it never lived up to the potential primarily because it was stuck in an 8-bit environment and could not evolve to actually perform the way it needed to, which needed 16 and 32-bit machines. So that went, and it went down like the Titanic, and I went with it.
At the same time, I think Apple was coming into its own, although they were making mistakes along the way, with the Lisa, and as I recall.
This is contemporaneous with the Lisa and that. They were direct competitors. So these are back in the days when, again, I thought, to me, the only two guys who knew what the heck they were talking about were Bill and Steve. Were the two guys that I was competing against. And I think they knew my name, but I've always joked that I think if Bill Gates found out where I was, he'd send a hit squad still today. And Steve probably would have tried to ignore me if he had the chance, but there are an awful lot of bits and pieces of things, of changes that happen in those machines. Little things like the inclusion of a backspace key on the damn keyboards. Pardon me for cussing, but little tiny things that were battles of wills in terms of this is a correct way to do things. And so I championed those things, and I tilted at a lot of windmills, I suppose.
I remember that an IBM serviceman wore a three-piece suit. So he'd crawl into a mainframe or a System 38 or System 34 with that suit on, and then the whole culture of the computer industry changed, and no longer was an IBM repairman in a three-piece suit. So
Right.
it seems to me it wasn't just the technology innovation; the whole culture of the business changed.
Correct. There was a matter of social innovation as well. That the purpose and goal, what we believed about the PC was that it was going to make people more able to do the things they wanted to do. I think I've written a couple of things somewhere that, if I can remember how I put it, it used to be that in a computer room, they would have fire extinguishers, halon extinguishers that would go off to save the equipment. They'd kill the operators. It would kill the operators, but they'd save the equipment. And so that kind of showed where operators were at in the scheme of things in terms of their relative value. I will point out a parallel between that and Morse code operators in the telegraph industry. And in writing my book and in examining this, I found an awful lot of parallels between the fact that we worship equipment and we worship technology. And I use the word worship advisedly, but we tend to put our tools as being more important than the person using the tool. And my maxim starting back then in the early days of the computer industry was that the most important component in any system is the user. And I see that as being as true today, and it's always been true, but that's kind of the policy that I push.
We forget from time to time because we become, I think, maybe overwhelmed or by the technology or the promise that we think the technology has, and so we forget about the people that are involved in it or behind it. I was reading the blog posts that you do in QRZ on your QRZ page.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that you were a collector of old Morse code books before you wrote your book. Did I get that right? That you've actually done quite a lot of research on the Morse code before you wrote your book, and when you wrote your book, and we'll talk about that and the name of the book. Could you talk a little bit about the research that you did on the Morse code before you wrote your book?
Sure. Well, the research, I love researching. I love reading. I love studying, and I love knowing how things work. But the specific path that I took is that after I came back into radio, and by the way, I never stopped doing Morse code in my head, not for 1 minute. I was QRT for 25 years. I was off the air. I called myself a migrant programmer at the time because I too busy moving. I had wife and kids and all that, and moving around the country, following the job caravan, so to speak. And the idea of building a station and putting up antenna towers and all that was simply not practical or possible. And so many people, I've run into so many guys for whom that was true, that there's this middle period in their life when they're expanding their career and expanding their families, when ham radio falls to a second level tier, to a second tier thing. But in my brain, I was always a ham. I kept my call, and I was always in Morse code. My ringtone on my cell phone was in Morse code. And in fact, I had it set up. It sent 37 word a minute gibberish. And it was great in meetings. I could be sitting in meetings and it would go, and I could look at that and go, oh.
Oh,
even if it meant
excuse
nothing.
me, gentlemen, I must leave.
Exactly. I did that so
That's my
times.
secretary sending me.
No, it was the servers. I had the servers set up so that they would alert me if there was something going on, and I'd get this Morse code message on my cell phone. It was fantastic. So I was never far away from Morse code at any time during my absence from ham radio actively being on the air and operating. And of course, all my friends, I still had many, many friends who were hams actively on the air every day. And I was in contact with that. But I myself didn't have a station set up. But when I went forward to get back into the hobby, it was kind of a funny thing. I had been hauling around the boxes of my station when I took it down in California. I'd been hauling them around literally for 20 years. I had like 10 big boxes full of junk, radios and cables and just the whole mess that was a shack. And everywhere I went, I took that stuff with me. And in the meantime, I got married again. I had been married once from a woman who came to her senses and realized that that was not the deal she was looking for. But I got married again to a woman who had never heard of ham radio, or she'd heard of it perhaps, but knew nothing about it. And I wasn't active as a ham. But she kept saying, when are you going to empty those boxes and get those boxes out of the closet? That turned out to be a mistake from her perspective because it was like a cornucopia. The boxes came out and went, and it went all over the roof of the house and it spread out and it filled up a room. And she had no idea what genie she was letting out of the bottle.
But she appreciates it now.
She appreciates it, I think, because she appreciates technology, but she's not a technologist. She is a master gardener. I don't know if you know what master gardeners are. Here in the United States, that is a formal organized group run by universities that organize people who are interested in home gardening, but they're pretty formal about it. You have to take classes and you have to get recertified every year that you're in it, and you have to contribute time. And she's been doing that for 25 or 30 years. And master gardeners tend to be as crazy about gardening as ham radio operators are about ham radio. So she is deeply involved in that and spends many hours every day out turning our beautiful little lot here in the Portland area into a beautiful, beautiful garden. It's really, really gorgeous. So she appreciates that, but she's anti-antenna. See, I don't live in an area that has a homeowners association, but I have a wife who is very jealous architecturally. And we did a lot of bicycling. Bicycling was one of my other hobbies before my heart went south. So I used to ride a bike a couple hundred miles a week and was deeply involved in the bicycle business for quite some time. And we're out in the country one day riding on our bikes, and we come around a corner and there's a big farmer's field full of antenna towers. And I said, "Oh, wow, look at that." And she said, "Oh, my God, that's awful." And that's when I knew we were going to have interesting conversations in the future, when I finally decided to put back up antennas again. But we have learned the art of compromise as we've come along, and so I have appropriate antennas on our small city lot. I don't. I'm not one of these people who say, "Well, I'm going to put up a 100-foot tower here on my lot that's 50 feet wide." I would never do that. There are some people who do, but that's not me.
Well, you put up I noticed on your QRZ page that you put up a hex beam. How do you like?
Oh, I love my hex beam. It's a fantastic antenna. It replaced a little 2-element N6BT multi antenna that you would change you had a little rotor box that would change change coils. You'd switch coils on it remotely to change the band you were on. And that worked pretty well. That worked pretty darn well. But eventually it melted down. It was very sensitive to SWR. And I think I tried to operate it one day when there was ice on the antenna. I fried all the internals of it. So the hex beam went up as a replacement that I couldn't fry even if I tried. But again, it's up 10 meters in the air, 30 feet in the air is where the top of it is. And that's about the maximum that I could do here without creating a lot of waves in the whole neighborhood. It's just inappropriate to put up something more than that here. It's not appropriate to where we live.
Do people notice it, though? I mean, do you think? Unless they're alerted to it.
I've had hams walk up to the house and knock on the door. I've had people who are walking by the house ask me for explanations about it. And one of the neighbors, it's really funny, the old 2-element beam was the smallest beam, I think, available in the world. There's nothing really smaller. And one of the neighbors, when it first went up, said, "Oh, why do you have that massive TV antenna on top of your house?" And I said, "Oh, Ruth, you have no idea. This is not a massive antenna by any stretch of the imagination. It gets a lot bigger than that." So yeah, we've had people notice it, but it's low key. I also have an end-fed that runs up into a neighbor's tree. The neighbor very graciously lets me put the end of it up over the top of his tree and drop a rope down to hold it up in the air. So those are the antennas that we use here at Chaos Manor.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. Go back to the research that you did, because I saw in your book,
sure.
the book, and I'll mention the title here, The CW Way of Life, Learning, Living, and Loving Morse Code in a Digital World by Chris Rutkowski. You did some research, and what I thought was interesting in the book was you discuss harmonic origins of Morse code. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that means in terms of, was that what Samuel F.B. Morse had in mind when he created the Morse code, and what's that about?
No, that's not what Morse had in mind. And in fact, the Morse code was not developed by Morse, as many people know these days. The only Morse code ever done was a series of numbers that counted squiggly lines on a chart. You'd count they called it counting the points, and 1 through 5 points was the numbers 1 through 5. And then there was a shift long character. If you did that, then 1 through 5 was 6 through 0. And all communication was done by sending numbers across the line. And they had a lookup dictionary, in which the numbers corresponded to words. And so you would send only the numbers across. And that was based on the French system, the French chape visual telegraphs, which looked like, I always say it looked like giant Boy Scouts on top of wooden towers on hilltops all over France. They had hundreds of these things spread across France, where these arms would be moved up and down manually, and those were putting out numbers that went into a lookup dictionary. And Samuel Morse saw that in operation when he was living in France as an art student. He was out walking around and visited one of these places, and so he knew of that system, and that was basically the system that he put into the only actual Morse code, was this code, the first code that he developed. That mercifully was probably only used, a half a dozen or 10 times in history. For some very early demos, it did not catch on. And of course, there was no hope of it catching on because it was intellectually incorrect. And it went on from there in the development. But you ask about how the research led into it. My research had an interesting path. I had not always been interested in the history of Morse or the history of radio and that sort of thing. But a number of years ago, one of the fellows in the club that I'm a member of here, the Willamette Valley DX Club, came to the meeting with an announcement and said there's going to be a radio sport contest held here in Portland called the Friendship Radio Sport Games. And it includes yada, 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 and a Morse code sending contest. And when I heard him say that, that was another one of those, the bomb went off in my brain. I had no idea that I wanted to do that until somebody mentioned it as a possibility. And I knew that I wanted to win it. It's very ironic that I threw myself into that so thoroughly. And it involved using the straight key. Now, I had always known that I was very, very good on the straight key from the time I was a child. My father had taught me a particular straight key operating technique. I didn't realize that it was different from what most people did, by the way. To me, it was the normal way because it's the only way I ever learned it. But one of the results of it was that I was very, very good on a straight key from the time I was a child. And in fact, one of my early great experiences was when I went to take my general test down in Philadelphia. You used to have to go to the Federal Communications Office in the government building to take your exam. And I went down there, and there were 20 or 30 people in the room. I remember it was fairly crowded. It was all men sitting there, all men and one boy, me, sitting in the group. And my friend Carl, who was a couple of years older than I was, sitting there. And when it came my turn, I went up and I started sending, and I only sent a few characters, a couple of words, and the examiner said, there's a problem here with my earphones. They aren't working. Would you mind if I pipe this through the speaker system so I can hear it? And he said, I don't care. Sure, no problem. So I went on and I'm sending, and I sent, probably 18 words a minute, kind of my normal default speed. I sent it along and I finished it. And the examiner said, that, gentleman, is what it's supposed to sound like.
Interesting.
And that was the proudest day in my 12-year-old life at that time.
Your father had an obvious impact on the way that you operate and how you teach Morse code sending and receiving. And I think that comes out in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
You'll recognize many of the things that I've said. I think you'll see them in the book because they're going to come flowing through it. And I think you'll have a better understanding of some of the things I'm talking about. And you'll also see why I also consider, I need to write a second edition, because I've learned more since I wrote it. I keep learning more about especially about how to teach it. And there's a cross feedback back from LICW that some of the things LICW is doing. I tell people in the book, I say that learning the lingo takes longer than learning the code. And I really do believe that. Learning a new alphabet is not that big a deal. There's only 26 letters and 10 numerals. It's, you already know SOS. That's 10% of the language right there. Done. It's easy. But learning the lingo takes a long time for people to get comfortable with how to speak in a Morse environment.
I see that transition from writing, because we were taught to write down for the test. Mm-hmm. 5 words a minute, 15 words a minute, you had to write. But to be able to go from wanting to write it down, I'll just write down the call sign, try to keep it together. I like this idea of actually saying the letter as you're hearing the letter, because all of a sudden it seems to me that should start fusing the Morse code to the letters, because that's how we think, right? So,
well, as I describe it in the book, I call it code talking, and my dad taught me code talking as a little kid. To teach to talk Morse code back and forth was effectively how I learned it. And one of the drills that I teach people for how to get a good fist is to first learn to say the letters correctly, and your voice can get the timing, da 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 da. Your voice can do a very good job of making nice das and dits. It's not hard at all to do that. Very easy. But then as you say, you don't say the letter, throw that alphabet away. That's not the one we're learning here. You say da 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 da. And when you're saying da 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 da, at the same time, make your hand follow your voice. Da 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 da. That's how you teach your hand the code to send it right, is you let your voice control the hand. Da 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 da. And I injured my arm once, and I had to shift to the left hand, and I had to teach myself again. I was very crude at first, but that's how you do it. My dad called it say and play. You say it and play the same letter at the same time as you're saying it. You're letting your voice be the controller, and then later on you let your voice stop. And the goal here is that what you're sending on the code is your voice. The noise that's coming out of it is your voice. That key becomes an extension of you, and the sound that's coming out is just another form of my voice. I'm speaking. And the other thing I teach myself is it's called mimicry, because I'm mimicking myself with my voice. I also, on the code, I mimic myself with my paddles. The way I learned to go really fast, or really fast at all, is you send something or program it into a program. Most paddles are programmable, rigs are programmable, so you can press a function key and send something. You put it in and you send a word through the keyer and go, and then duplicate it, mimic it with your hand. Play it and go, and try to make it sound exactly the same way. Don't think about meaning, make it sound the same. And do it over and do repetitions until you get the sound pattern right and you're mimicking the keyer. And that's how you get yourself to go faster and get yourself to go smoother, is you're using the keyer as an adjunct to your internal voice. You see, that thing called mimicry. Mimicry is how we learn almost everything. Most of learning is mimicry in the human animal. And so you have to leverage that when you're learning Morse code. Find things to mimic. And that's how you burn it into your brain. That's how you create those mental pathways that need to be there. It's just mimicry.
There's something that you write on your blog about the width of a dime for setting up the straight key. Did I get that right? In terms of if you're trying to set the contact point distance,
Mm-hmm.
could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the width, calling it the width of a dime is really totally arbitrary. And I kind of do that or use other measures because you have to start somewhere. If somebody's picking up a key for the first time, they say, how do I adjust this? And if you go on the air or you read in books, you will find a dozen or 100 different advices. I say, width of a dime is okay. It's kind of the way I would put it. Kind of, that's okay. That'll work. I encourage people to experiment, even before they ever know the Morse code, to sit down and treat it as an extension of their arm, like a musical device almost, and to start moving it and just feel what it feels like, and make it big, make it a real big gap, and make it smaller, and make it heavy, and make it light, and change in there and feel it. Learn to feel with your hand what those feel like, and just settle on something that feels okay to you right now. And that's going to change, but it's going to change because you're going to go, that's not right. You're going to want to make it smaller or larger or harder or softer, or maybe not. Maybe you'll leave it right where you put it on day one. It's not that critical. And that's what I try to emphasize to people, is that a lot of things that people put a lot of sweat into trying to figure out turn out to be not really all that important once you learn how to operate Morse, once you learn what Morse code is really supposed to do. I call it training the keyer in your brain. It's not about the key. It's about the keyer. And that's the one that's up here between your ears. And once the keyer is trained, I can send on bare wires, or I could send by sitting up and down on a key, or with my left foot if it came to it. Doesn't matter. The code is in me. And so I can go dot it on anything. And the settings don't really matter. However, when I'm trying to go fast, I end up actually with extremely small settings and very light settings. But and people say, well, should I do that? And I say, a rock star's guitar won't make you a rock star. You have to learn how to control. And once you learn, you'll decide whether that's the right thing for you or not. And anyway, I was going to tell about the research path. The research path started when I decided that I wanted to go into this contest for Morse code sending. And I started looking online, researching on the internet, just how do you do that? And to be blunt, I found nothing about how to go fast on a straight key. Nothing. I couldn't find old records, new records, historical records, nothing about the technique of how to do it. I was amazed that there was so little written about it. And I think what happened then was that most people learned it by elmering, by walking into a telegraph office and hanging out with the operators there and watching how they do it. And you sort of picked it up almost osmotically, where it kind of got absorbed through your skin. You picked it up. So there was nothing really written about it. There was this vacuum. And I remember one day, it was one specific moment when I was sitting there practicing on the straight key, running my practice drills, when the thought occurred to me, who invented the straight key? And I'd never thought about it. I'd been using one for 60 plus years, and I had no idea where or how or when it got invented. And that research line took me into the whole world of research into Morse. And so that was when the acquisition of every book and magazine and printout that I could find, I started voraciously reading the history. That was when I also determined that, what do you mean Morse didn't invent the Morse code? Really? And some people still say, no, he invented it. But the evidence says that it was a joint effort with him and a partner. Morse had partners? We never hear about Morse's partners. Morse had a partner, a fellow named Alfred Vail, a fellow from New Jersey. And it looks like good old Alfred Vail had more to do with the invention of the code than Morse did. But they were partners up through the first 5-6 years of the operations of Morse's operations. And this Vail fellow played a crucial role. Some people give him credit for it now. Not everybody. Not everybody gives him the full credit. Some people still say, well, it was Morse's code. Well, the deal that Vail had with Morse was an interesting one, by the way. He had a development deal in which, for patent reasons, everything that Vail developed was developed in Morse's name. And every patent done had only Morse's name on it.
How
So
painful.
Vail got very painful. Vail got no credit for the things that he invented. And it turns out that most of the important pieces that made Morse's system a viable thing in the world were developed by Alfred Vail, not by Morse.
Interesting. So like the ratio of 3 dits to a daw, that kind of stuff was Vail, or did that come
Well,
later?
that ratio didn't even exist back then.
Uh-huh.
In fact, the original Morse code that was used, which evolved into what we called American Morse, the telegrapher's Morse, didn't have a 3-to-1 ratio. It had ratios of 2, 4, and 5. It didn't use 3-to-1 at all. The 3-to-1 actually came out of the work of a German fellow, Gerke, Friedrich Gerke, who was running the German post office and was hired to put together the German telegraph system. Developed the Gerke or German code, which became the international code, which is what ham radio and everybody in the world uses today. So that didn't even really come it, but it was based on the work that Vail had done. Vail is the one who turned it into a dot and dash code as opposed to a number counting code. And there is no absolute proof of any of that. It is not documented anywhere. It was very assiduously left out of any of the documentation, any of the records that we have. And all of Vail's records were turned over to Morse and Morse's family when Vail died. So they had 20 or 30 years in which they could remove anything from the written record that they didn't like. That didn't help to make Morse out to be the creator of all these things. So that Evan by itself is a fascinating story. And in fact, we wouldn't know anything about Vail. Vail would be even more forgotten by history, but for his wife, who at the end of Vail's life, his wife Amanda kind of demanded that Vail be given the recognition for the work that he had done, and started collecting scrapbooks of all of that and taking it to newspapers and taking it to editors and taking it to other inventors and demanding that Alfred be given his due recognition. So there's a strong possibility that we wouldn't know any of this but for her. So I thought at the time I was thinking of writing a book about Vail and perhaps even just about his wife. Because I found that story so interesting, and I was looking at doing a thorough biography of it, which was way out of my wheelhouse. I'd never done anything like that, but it certainly looked like an interesting thing to pursue. I was scheduled to go to the Smithsonian. I had an appointment to go to the Smithsonian to spend a couple of weeks, literally in the basement. I had access to Vail's original records. I was going to go there and study it, and that was set for May of 2020.
So you got the pandemic knocked you out of the box there.
It knocked me out of the box. And I went from there then to having other things that were cooking around. There was a second book floating around in my head, which was a book about how to do Morse and how to learn Morse. And that was inspired first by discovering that how the Morse code got developed was somewhat mysterious. The invention of the straight key was a bit of a mystery. There were all these little mysteries contained in it. But also, when I came back into radio after having been out of it for a while, and I got on the news groups and started seeing what other people were talking, what I found was what I considered to be a bunch of BS about straight keys, myths.
Mm-hmm.
There were myths floating around, one of which really got me was that the straight key causes glass arm. And people were said, you shouldn't use the straight key because it's going to hurt your arm. You're going to hurt yourself with it and cause yourself damage. And I think I mentioned this in the book. The thing that struck in my mind instantly was, well, if that's the case, how is it that I've been using a straight key all of my life, and I'm one of the fastest straight key people walking on the globe, and I've never developed glass arm? Therefore, your theory must be wrong, because not me. So your theory has to explain why not me, or you don't have a theory at all. You got nothing. Was kind of the approach to it. In fact, I'm going to be doing a talk on that here in the next couple of weeks, that aspect of it. And that was a motivation to say I wanted to kind of correct that. Well, what then? What causes it? What were the causes were what I wanted to start researching. And I started doing research into the ergonomics of it, which, going back, I had done research in bicycle ergonomics. And previously I'd done research in computer ergonomics and computer interfacing. So moving into Morse code and key ergonomics was to me a natural extension of what I'd been doing my whole life, the things that had fascinated me. One of the other things that I heard that I thought was a myth was that some of the teaching groups that were teaching Morse code wouldn't let people use a straight key because you can't operate a straight key well enough to have a good enough fist to operate. Hold on there. Slow down, Tex. What are you saying to me? And so I was very annoyed by what I thought was another myth. The straight key is much too hard to operate. You can't, and a new learner should never hear imperfect Morse. He has to hear perfect Morse from a paddle because you don't want to poison his mind with bad Morse from the beginning. Well, this is to me, this is all just coming out as nonsense.
I think we were all poisoned with bad Morse from the beginning. If we started years ago as a novice, right?
Yes, but the point was how to not be poisoned by it. How did I had to go back and in my own head say, well, how did I achieve it? And that was what I had to research. I had to kind of dig into my own memories and remember what my father had done with me when I was a little kid that I hadn't thought about in 50 years or more. I had given it no thought at all. And I had to kind of try and reconstruct, well, how was I taught? And how does that differ from what's being taught commonly today? And try to put that together into a system. So that became then the genesis of the book. And the book was to say, well, I've got this Morse history that I think is important, and it's got the physics of how it works, which was part of my research that nobody had done. The harmonic aspect, which you asked about a moment ago, that's original with me, to the best of my knowledge. I've never seen anything even vaguely like that in any other issue, and it was discovery. And it was discovery based upon the other thing that bugged me, that really bothered me, was this thing about the 3-to-1 ratio between dits and das, which is the formal definition is a 3-to-1 ratio. But they tell people you have to work on 3-to-1, you have to work on 3-to-1, and they'll get a computer software that shows, little, trying to show, oh, you're not quite, they aren't exactly 3-to-1 and all that. And they're trying to make it perfect by looking at a computer feedback. And I realized that had nothing to do with how I'd learned to make Morse, and my fist is as good as anyone's. My dad used to say, if they can tell what kind of key you're using, you're doing it wrong. They should not be able to tell. The notion of harmonic Morse is that you actually have dits and das are harmonic waves when they're looked at in terms, I can hold my arm up here, in terms of how the arm is moving. There are these harmonic waves you correct. And if you're working on the basis of a circle, which is the internal thing, you've got a 50% duty cycle as you're going up and down in the cyclic action. So the key of harmonic is getting this whole harmonic system of the key and the hand and the arm all working in a harmonic system in which it then wishes to flow. And you get this beautiful flow that can occur. And I never, ever think about 3-to-1. There's no time in my career as an operator that was ever the slightest interest to me. And yet I know that I know how to do it. It's completely automatic. It comes out of the keyer in my brain knows how to make my arm vibrate with anything. I can, as I said, I can use bare wires or an expensive key. It doesn't matter. I can make fun car horns. I love sending code to people on car horns.
Oh, you're that guy.
You can get away with a lot of stuff that you can't get away with hand gestures. So.
Do you use a straight key? Is the straight key your go-to key now, or because I know that you also collect like vibroplex bugs and things like that?
Well, I'm what a friend of mine calls a keyholic. I'm going to change to the other camera that I have set up here. This is because I'm doing all these demos and on the LICW and such. And
so for the listeners, you're using a camera that's now looking down on your desk at all of your keys.
Right. And on the desk right now, I have set up, this is a This is a $30-something 3D printed key.
Right.
This is a NATO key, which is a fabulous key that most people don't know. The one next to it is a Chinese key, stainless steel key, which is available on eBay, which is a superb speed key, just absolutely superb. And then I've got a couple of my favorite bugs laid out. And over in the distance is my Marconi replica made by I1QOD, which is Frattini. I couldn't remember his last name there for a moment. That's the key I used in the competition. It's still one of my favorites. I change keys. I keep some out that I use all the time. This key, the $35 key, I have on the desk because I tell people that, again, it isn't the key, it's the keyer. I can send just as well on this $35 key as I can on the $500 Marconi that's down at the end. They really are. It's the keyer in my brain is what makes most of the difference. Are there small differences in speed? Sure. Do they feel different? Sure. Do I like one better than the other? Absolutely. But this key, this little $35 key, once it's held down properly on the desk, by the way, magic that most people don't know about is that you got to get it held down to the desk. If it can move around at all, you're in trouble. And here I'll give a plug for a company I have nothing to do with. I don't know if this will show up right on the camera, if it's upside down or whatever, but a product called Quakehold Museum Putty that I use. I don't know if that's readable by your folks, but this stuff is available on Amazon. And Quakehold is it's just like bubble gum, and you put gobs of it under the feet of something, and you press it down on a flat tabletop like this, and even this little key that weighs nothing is really, really down on the surface. It takes that much work.
But you're doing something that I've never seen before.
What's that?
Your keys are hanging out over the edge of the table. Maybe I've been doing it wrong all these years, but when I used a straight key, my straight key was kind of like my arm was resting on the desk, and so you use your keys with the lever sticking out over the floor?
Again, more is made of that than needs to be made, in my opinion. I'll point out.
Well, you're talking about that harmonic action and not getting a glass arm.
My elbow is actually on the arm of my chair.
I see.
Yeah, but I don't want my forearm lying on a table because that's going to suppress the harmonic motion. The key control is being done by the upper arm, not by the wrist, not by the forearm, and certainly not by the fingers. This isn't what's doing the work. The work is being done up here. Bicep and tricep.
Tricep are actually doing the keying.
It's da, down, da, da. And the little brachioradialis that comes up here is like taps. That's where the taps come from to make dits happen. And they squirt out the arm like throwing a rock across a pond. I'm sure everybody's done that, where you skip a rock across a pond. That's how I send dits. Triplet of dits comes out like that. It's just that happens across. If you were a drummer.
And that's why you're not getting the glass arm. Right.
Well, the other part of not getting the glass arm, there's a specific problem with keying that is taught, and it was taught by the U.S. military in its famous videos of how to use a straight key, which are wonderful videos until it gets to the point of how to use it. And they show. Let me see. I can move the camera just a little bit here. Hopefully that'll show it. They show operating with moving the wrist like this, flexing the wrist up and down, and or with the fingers, right?
Yeah.
This is what's called in ergonomics is called an awkward posture. And it is not the recommended position. In fact, in ergonomics, they tell you to not design machinery that requires this kind of a motion because it causes carpal tunnel syndrome. Okay. And that's not the way my father taught me. My father said, he said, your arm is going to get tired if you do that. Hold your hand like this. And he reached over my shoulder and grabbed my hand and turned it like this. He said, there, do it that way. As soon as you turn your hand like that, a funny thing happens. The muscles that are being recruited by your brain change from this recruits the forearm muscles. When you go like this, it's like all of a sudden up here in the upper arm is where the work wants to be done by your brain. And this is called the position of function. And it's, again, well known in ergonomics. If you ever break your arm, this is how the doctors will set it. They'll set your arm in the relaxed position of function.
Yeah. I know this from a fall, right?
If you're walking down the street with your arms at your side, your
Uh-huh.
hands go like this into that position, the position of function, not like this, not flat-handed. So this position of function is critical. And when you're like that, it changes the way you're articulating. It changes the muscle groups. It lets you use the upper arm muscles as opposed to the forearm muscles. Of course, they're all coordinated together. Things are still moving, but most of the work is being done up topside, and you avoid some of the things that can happen when you do this. And that's what this talk I'm going to be doing is about. I actually did experiments on that and came up with some amazing results from my experiments.
For the podcast listeners who are listening to this right now, I'll put up the video so that you can actually see, and I'll even time mark where Chris is showing
Okay.
how you orient your hand in order to be able to keep from getting carpal tunnel and even glass arm from sending straight key. And Chris, how fast can you go on a straight key? I mean, you won the contest.
When I was in practice, and this is 8 years ago or 9 years ago, I was around 30 words a minute on the straight key for plain text. I won the contest. I was over 26 words a minute, sending mixed letter number groups, random groups, over 26. Somewhere between 26 and 27 is how fast I was. That's pretty fast by most standards. These days, I can go 25 on demand. My base speed, I can go 18, 20, 22, 23, just.
Oh yeah, that's amazing.
I just sent your call, by the way. I don't know if you got that.
I saw that you're a member of the Long Island CW Club, and I think you've done some stuff for CW Ops. Is there some concessions that they're making towards your ideas about how to actually properly send the code? I mean, are they revising some of the ways that they're teaching? I mean, I took a CW Ops course, which I thought was an amazing course. Of course, I used a bug. I noticed that my Morserino does not like my Morse code in terms of decoding it unless I'm doing exactly the 1-to-3 ratio. Is there some reconsideration that's happening in the CW community based on what you're discovered and what you're sharing?
Yeah, very much so. I can't speak for CW Ops as much because I'm not a member of it because I don't like doing the CW Ops tests, the things of just getting on and sending 599, a number in my name, repeatedly a couple of times a week. Never appealed to me. Again, ADHD. About 5 minutes of that is all I can take before I lose interest in it and get bored. But I've been working with LICW quite a bit, and the LICW intro classes now teach this method of handling the key, the introductory to handling, and most of the teachers who are teaching key operation at all are following this, and they're pretty much insisting on they don't insist on the use of a straight key, but they suggest it as the best way to get started in a Morse career, something with which I agree. So I'm participating in those groups and in those sessions frequently, usually a couple of times a week. I participate in that. So if they go into the introductory classes, they'll find all of that there and present in it. And I can't say that everybody in LICW has the book, but it certainly is pretty broadly spread. I think it's well known in that group. So that's going very well. And I see a lot of people having more attention on having a good fist. The idea of where a fist comes from, the idea of flow, of flowing from one character to the next, of being able to move through Morse, as opposed to this Farnsworthing that you hear about. Farnsworthing is the term for putting in more space between the characters.
Right.
In order to give yourself more time to recognize it and then to type the letter or something, to do a copying thing. But that space breaks the flow of the code. It would be like S, P, E, L, L, I. Spelling out words in English has the same effect of like, oh, will you please get it done? Instead of saying Spelling, puff, and it becomes a word.
Right.
That's the way the Morse code works. When the letters are flowed together with the correct spacings, they not only sound good, it's also much easier for your brain to go poof and assemble them into the things they need to assemble into. And so that's them.
Is there an ideal speed then for sending the Morse code to communicate in Morse? An ideal speed target to get to be able to have a pleasant communication on Morse code?
There are a couple of different levels. First off, I had pleasant conversations with people at 5 words a minute when I was a novice, and people are having pleasant conversations and pleasant interactions today at any speed. There is no one correct speed. But the levels that we had back in the day that were organized around the license requirements of 5 words a minute, 13 words a minute, 20 words a minute, 25 words a minute. These are levels that are built into the physics of your brain. I've discovered that there are real reasons why those numbers are what they are. They weren't accidental or arbitrary. It has to do with how the brain is processing dots and dashes into things. It's making sets out of individual elements, and there's a set theory going on. And that's a natural thing. I have, it's my opinion, I haven't been able to test it enough to prove it to people, but I have what I would call a natural speed. And that is, and this is something that's been found in linguistics in general, is that people have a characteristic speed of talking. They have a characteristic speed of walking and moving. They have, everybody, all of us, and all individuals have a characteristic kind of frequency that we're operating at. And that frequency, whatever that is, that's your native frequency. That's kind of like native to you. And that's your best speed. That's the speed at which you'll be most comfortable. It's my opinion that that will occur for most people in the 18 to 20 word a minute range, because that's the range at which you're able, you no longer want to or can count. There's a common knowledge thing is saying, well, you don't want people to count how many dots and how many das, how many dits and how many das are coming along. But one of the maxims that I came up with is that if the brain can count, it will. The brain's always doing one of two things. It's either counting things or it's fusing them into assemblies. It's either having individual things or it's making sets out of things. Your brain is automatically doing that all the time. And what you want to do is you want to be operating at a level where you're hearing and creating sets. And that really starts getting solid around 18 words a minute, is around where most people start having to hear the code as sets. So that's a very, very comfortable speed, I think, for good, solid Morse code communication. There's another level that happens, and that's the one right above the pro level, 27, 28 words a minute. For just general QSO rag chewing, that's my favorite speed. And I find there to be an awful lot of guys who find that to be the best speed for a rag chew, for just having conversation. The words are coming out fast enough that you're not going, will you please finish? You know, they're spelling out T, H, E. Oh God, you know, the brain is automatically trying to guess it, and you're counting. You want it to be fast enough. THE, NEXT, TIME, WETALK, WEWILL, BUT, THE, WRDS, TOGETHER. That kind of speeding and spacing. And in fact, one of the things I recommend people do is exactly that. Spell and speak out the letters. Take your normal language and just speak it. That'll teach you everything you need to know about timing Morse code.
Oh, wow.
That the correct spacings and the correct timings, your brain already knows how to do that because it's all part of your linguistic system. It's not a new skill. The only thing new about Morse is that it's an alphabet. It's just a different alphabet. But all the rules of how you use it are the same ones your brain is already using for whatever language you already speak.
Oh, that's interesting. And at that 27 words a minute, are you using a straight key?
No, sir. That's too fast for a straight key, and that's why the bug was invented, quite literally, because going at those speeds is tiring. Even if you're good at it and you don't have an injured arm, anybody will get tired going at 27 to 30 words a minute for a long time. That's work. That starts getting to the point where you've got to focus and bear down and keep going, and it requires you to be fit and strong and healthy, and you got to keep with it. It's just too fast for practical use in a straight key, and that's why the bug was invented, because nobody wanted to you know, they talk about it having stopped glass arm, which is true to a degree, but that's because people were required to go 27 to 30 words a minute, and that was a lot of work, and you can hurt yourself going that fast again, especially if you're not using this position of function. If you're doing this with your wrist at 27 or 30 words a minute, or this with your fingers, you can hurt yourself. And that is the source of the glass arm. So you really don't want to do that if you can avoid it. The bug was invented so you didn't have to. That you could go at the same speeds, minimum speed on a typical vibroplex, around 23 words a minute. That's not an accident.
It rotates your wrist 90 degrees. So
exactly, your wrist ends up in the position of function again. When
right.
You're operating a bug or a cootie, you end up in the position of function, and that's why those things are better for your wrist.
Okay, cootie. What's a cootie?
I thought people knew that. Cootie is basically two straight keys turned on their sides, so that left and right you get the dits and das being made as you're going back and forth. And
so you could take a J38, two J38 keys, put them back to back on their side, and that's a cootie.
Yeah, sort of. That would be the crudest.
That'd be a crude cootie
we made when we were. Yeah, exactly. That's the kind we made when we were kids, but they actually make them now. They use hacksaw blades and all sorts of things to make these things that move back and forth. The problem with them is this harmonic keying, and part of it is covered in the book, although I didn't cover it, is that it isn't just sine waves to make dits and das. And as a result, cootie sending will often, I describe it as a lot of people sound like they're drunk. That there's
right.
slurring between the changing between the dits and the das, and it just isn't clear, and their enunciation is not clear. And so I don't particularly like it. They're hard to use. I consider it one of the hardest keys to use, especially it's probably the easiest key to use after a straight key, but the hardest key to use well out of all the manual keys. And there are very few people who are good on it.
Is a cootie used to do side swiping then? Is that what we're talking about?
That's cootie and side swiper are synonyms.
Right. Okay. And
a cootie is a side swiper.
And do you do side swiping?
No, sir.
Because that's a different skill.
It's a different skill, and I've just never been interested in it. Again, back in the day, nobody did it. I didn't know I'd never seen a side swiper until I came back into ham radio 20 years ago. And that was one of the myths that I heard, was people saying, don't bother learning on a straight key because you'll hurt yourself. Use this thing called a side swiper. And I'm going, what? You want to do what? And so I hear a lot of people sending really bad Morse code because they're trying to do it on a side swiper, and getting the timing exactly right on a side swiper is very difficult. The transitions between dits and das is very complex and not easy. And that's why I say it's really for experts. It's something that an expert should use.
Okay, so I just want to remind the listeners that your book is The CW Way of Life, Learning, Living, and Loving Morse Code in the Digital World by Chris Rutkowski. But I also wanted to let people know that if they use the link on the QSO Today show notes page, then you'll be using my Amazon account. And so therefore you'll be supporting the QSO Today podcast. You'll be supporting Chris with his wonderful book. And it will be on the show notes page, along with, if anybody's been looking over the last few weeks, the show notes have a lot of information that I didn't have before, thanks to AI. Before we go, what advice would you give to hams that are returning to the hobby after 25 years, or new hams that are starting the hobby that they want to do something interesting, out there, challenging? What advice would you give to them?
I would probably say the most interesting things I see going on these days are SOTA and POTA here in the States. Summits on the Air and Parks on the Air are two activities that really seem to be capturing the imagination of an awful lot of hams, because they allow you to get out. You don't have to have a big station. On the contrary, you're going to have a small station, especially with Summits on the Air, where you're carrying it all on your back or in your back pocket. So minimal stations to wonderful QTHs with high antennas that get out. And it's all Morse code, of course. And I find that people find those challenging and interesting and fun on a whole bunch of different levels. And so I think that that's a great way for people who are coming back in to take a look at that, especially if you're not. If you're housebound, well, that's a whole different story. But I'll always be a Morse code guy. But there are lots of activities. I'm no longer quite as anti things. I'm the president, as you said at the beginning, of the Willamette Valley DX Club. And most of the people in the club are crazy about FT8, these digital modes, whereas I'm, But I accept the fact that they are just, a lot of people say, well, that's not ham radio while you're letting the computer do the work. And my answer to that is people put just as much effort into building their station, just as much effort into listening, just as much effort into finding where the stations are. But the final QSO is in fact made by the operation is made after you press the button and say, okay, contact that guy. It's like pressing the key once and then it's like a really automatic key. You press it once and it'll do all the rest of it for you. That's an extension to me of the paddle. I see that as a logical extension of from paddles. You go to FT8 where you only have to press one button instead of two and you don't have to make all the letters yourself. And so I accept that. It really is ham radio. There's no question about it. And the good news is I see a lot of people doing that who start getting interested also in Morse and saying, well, I want more out of the hobby. And they're going to find that when they take the hobby away from the computer, that we've been giving it to our tools. Again, we worship our tools and we say, oh, look what the computer can do. We'll take it back and put it in this computer because this is still the most powerful pattern recognition computer in the universe. As of today, there's no computer anywhere that can keep up with the human brain. And so still today, honor and respect that and take care of it. And that's what ham radio can do for you.
Chris, you've been an absolutely wonderful guest. I'm so excited that we had this conversation. I've learned more about the Morse code than I thought I ever would, and I so appreciate it very much. So with that, thank you, 73, and thank you for coming on the QSO Today podcast.
73 4Z1UG NW6V. Clear.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Chris. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put an NW6V in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, push the Sponsor Transcription button in the center of every show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. If listener sponsorship is not for you, then please use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on everything you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast, and it costs you nothing. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform by using Podcast Index. Use the latest Podcast 2.0 player on your smartphone to automatically get to your podcast updates as soon as we publish. I'm now using Podverse to track, manage, and listen to my podcasts. Positive comments about QSO Today on social media is appreciated as it helps to grow our listener base. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who makes this podcaster and guests sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media, Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.